The rain in Portland did not fall that night. It hunted. It came down hard and sideways, slapping against the brick walls of the alley behind Burnside Street, drumming on the dented lid of a metal dumpster, hissing into the orange glow of a single sodium street lamp. The gutters gurgled. The wind moaned through the gap between two old warehouses, and underneath a flattened cardboard box that had once held a refrigerator, 18-year-old Marlo Whitmore lay curled on her side, her knees pulled tight against her chest, her arms wrapped around a faded blue backpack, as if it were the last living thing in the world. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. Her denim jacket, soaked through, had stopped being a jacket hours ago. It was just cold, wet weight now. Her teeth chattered in a steady, helpless rhythm she could no longer control. And every time the wind shifted, a fine spray of icy water found its way under the cardboard and crawled across her cheek like a slow, deliberate finger. She did not move. She could not afford to move. Movement meant attention. Attention meant trouble. 22 days. That was the number she kept repeating in her head like a prayer. 22 days since her 18th birthday. 22 days since the world had decided she was someone else's problem, and then decided she was no one's problem at all. She closed her eyes. The cold pressed against her like a living thing. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, the memory came back uninvited, the way memories do when you have nothing left to push them away with. It had been raining that day, too. The kitchen of the small ranch house on the east side of Portland had smelled like burned coffee and stale cigarette smoke. Marlo remembered standing in the doorway, 18 years old that morning, holding a cheap birthday card she had bought for herself at the drugstore because she was not sure anyone else would. Her mother, Renata, sat at the linoleum table with her fourth cup of coffee, staring at nothing. Her stepfather, Roy Crane, leaned against the refrigerator in his stained mechanic's jumpsuit, arms folded across his barrel chest. He was a man built like a stack of bricks with small, hard eyes and a permanent scowl carved into the corners of his mouth. He had not said happy birthday. He had said a single word. Out. Marlo had not understood at first. She had blinked at him, her birthday card crumpling slightly in her hand. She had looked at her mother, waiting for Renata to speak, to defend her, to do the thing mothers were supposed to do. Renata had not raised her eyes from the coffee. "You heard him," Renata had said, her voice flat as river stones. "You're 18. You're a grown woman. We're not running a hotel." Roy had moved past her, then brushing her shoulder hard enough to rock her against the doorframe. He had walked into Marlo's small bedroom, the one she had decorated with second-hand paperbacks and a single cracked mirror. And within 4 minutes, he had emerged carrying a black plastic garbage bag, bulging with everything she owned in the world. He had walked past her again. He had opened the front door. And he had thrown the bag, all of it, all of her, out onto the wet front lawn. Her clothes had spilled across the grass. A pair of her old sneakers had landed in a puddle. The rain had begun immediately to soak into her one good sweater, the green one her grandmother on her mother's side had knitted. Before she died, the only thing in that bag that mattered. Marlo had turned to face her mother one last time. Renata stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere on the cracked concrete of the porch. She did not look up. She did not say goodbye. She did not say her daughter's name. The door had closed. The deadbolt had turned with a small final click. That click, Marlo thought, now lying under the cardboard in the alley, was the sound her childhood had made when it ended. A bottle rolled somewhere near the mouth of the alley. Marlo's eyes snapped open. She held her breath. The bottle clinked against a brick and fell silent. Just the wind. Just the city eating itself in the dark. She let her breath out slowly, carefully, the way she had learned to do over the past 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 22 days. She had learned things in those days that no 18-year-old should have to learn. She had learned which shelters opened at 4 in the afternoon and which made you wait until 7, by which time the cold had already gotten into your bones. She had learned that the women's shelter on 11th was safe but full by sundown. She had learned that the mission on Burnside fed you a hot meal, but made you sit through 40 minutes of preaching first, and that was a fair trade most days. She had learned to sleep with her backpack strapped tight across her chest, because if you slept without it, you woke up without it. She had learned that some people in soup kitchens looked at her with pity, and that pity, while it stung, was not the worst thing. The worst thing was the men who looked at her with calculation, who saw a young woman alone and saw an opportunity. She had learned to keep her hood up, to keep her eyes down, to always sit near the staff, to always know where the door was. She had learned that hunger is not a sharp pain. Real hunger, the kind that sets in after the second day, is a dull, hollow ache that scrapes at the inside of your ribs and makes your hands shake when you try to hold a cup. She had learned that loneliness is colder than rain. A rat skittered along the base of the dumpster. Marlowe watched it pass through the small triangle of vision under her cardboard. Even the rats had somewhere to go. She closed her eyes again, and somewhere in the deep, cold corner of her chest, she felt the last small spark of hope go out. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow morning she would walk to the mission on Burnside. There was a soup kitchen attached. They served breakfast at 7. She would eat. She would warm up. And then she would figure out the next 24 hours. That was all anyone could do when you got down to it. The next 24 hours. She did not know it yet, but tomorrow morning was going to change everything. The mission's dining hall smelled of strong coffee, scrambled eggs, cooked too long, and wet wool. Outside the tall, fogged-up windows, Portland's gray morning pressed in like a sheet of damp paper. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and rows of folding tables stretched across a tile floor that had been mopped to a tired shine. Marlowe sat at the end of the third table, her back to the wall, her hood still up. She had a chipped plastic tray in front of her, a paper cup of black coffee, 2 pieces of toast, and a small mound of yellow eggs. She ate slowly, the way you learn to eat when you are not sure when the next meal will come. Each bite was a small, careful negotiation with her stomach. Around her, the room was full of the city's forgotten. An old man in a long brown coat muttered to himself between bites. A young couple, both rail-thin, shared a plate without speaking. A woman with a knitted cap, pulled down low over her eyes, sat across from Marlowe and stared into the middle distance, her hands wrapped around her coffee, like it was a candle she was afraid would go out. Marlowe was so focused on her eggs that she did not see the man enter. She heard him first, the wrong sound. Hard-soled shoes on wet tile. Most of the people in this room wore sneakers, work boots, anything soft and quiet. The clack of expensive leather on tile was a sound that did not belong here. It was a sound from another world. She lifted her eyes. He stood in the doorway, brushing rainwater off the shoulders of a charcoal gray overcoat. Beneath it, she could see the lapel of a suit jacket, also charcoal, perfectly tailored. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with a thick head of silver hair, combed neatly to one side, and a face that had the soft, weathered kindness of a man who had spent a lifetime explaining difficult things to people who did not want to hear them. He carried a slim leather briefcase in one hand, in the other a folded umbrella that dripped onto the tile. He did not look around like a tourist. He looked around like a hunter who was almost certain he had found his quarry. His eyes moved across the tables, past the old man, past the couple, past the woman in the knit cap. His eyes stopped on Marlowe. He started walking toward her. Every nerve in her body went on alert. Her right hand holding a fork slowly lowered to the tray, Her left hand drifted under the table and found the strap of her backpack. She measured the distance to the door at the back of the kitchen. 3 tables, maybe 20 feet. She could be up and gone in 5 seconds if she had to, but she did not run. Something in his face stopped her. He was not looking at her the way the bad men looked at her. He was looking at her the way a doctor looks at a patient he has been searching for in a crowded hospital. Concerned, focused, almost relieved. He stopped at the edge of her table. He set the briefcase down on the floor between his polished black shoes. He did not sit. He did not crowd her. He stood very still the way a man stands when he is trying very hard not to startle a wild animal. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was low, careful, professional. "I am very sorry to disturb your breakfast." Marlowe did not answer. She watched him. "My name is Walter Bishop," he said. "I am an attorney, a probate attorney to be specific. I am based out of an office on Southwest 6th Avenue. I have been looking for a young woman named Marlowe Whitmore for nearly 4 weeks. I have a private investigator on retainer. He believes you may be that young woman." Marlowe's mouth went dry. Her own name, spoken by a stranger in a charcoal suit, felt like a small electric shock. For 3 weeks she had been no one. Now this man was saying her name as if it mattered. "Why?" she asked. The word came out hoarse. She had barely spoken in days. Walter Bishop's mouth lifted at one corner. It was not quite a smile. It was something gentler than that, something sadder. "Because someone in your family has died," he said quietly, "and he left you everything he had." The folding chair across from her creaked as he finally lowered himself into it. He set his hands flat on the table. They were the hands of an older man, the knuckles a little swollen. A thin gold wedding band on his left ring finger. "I would very much like to buy you a real breakfast, Miss Whitmore," he said. "And then I would very much like to tell you a story you have never heard before." The office of Bishop and Associates sat on the 17th floor of a glass tower on Southwest 6th Avenue. The elevator climbed in a low, smooth hum that Marlowe could feel in the soles of her wet sneakers. When the doors slid open, she stepped out onto a carpet so deep and clean it felt almost wrong to walk on it. Walter Bishop's private office was paneled in oak the color of dark honey. There was a heavy desk, a wall of leather-bound law books, and tall windows that looked out over the Willamette River, gray and shining under a low sky. A young woman in a gray cardigan brought Marlowe a steaming ceramic mug of coffee with cream and sugar already stirred in. She brought a small white plate with 3 buttered croissants. She did not ask any questions. She set the food down, gave Marlowe a small kind nod, and left the room. Marlowe sat in a leather chair that swallowed her. Her hands shook around the warm mug. She had not held anything warm and clean in a long time. Walter Bishop sat across the desk from her. He had taken off his overcoat. He had loosened his tie 1 careful inch. He opened a thick manila folder and turned its first page, slowly, almost reverently, as if the papers inside were old photographs. "Marlowe," he said, "how much do you know about your father?" She looked up sharply. The croissant in her hand stopped halfway to her mouth. "My father? Yes. I don't know anything about my father." She set the croissant down. Her voice was quiet. "He left before I was born. My mother said he was a deadbeat. She said his name was William and that he ran out on her when she was 6 months pregnant. That's all she ever told me. She wouldn't even keep a picture." Walter nodded slowly as if he had expected exactly that answer. "His name was William Whitmore," he said, "and he is the reason I am sitting across from you this morning." He turned a page. "William passed away 17 years ago, Marlowe." A car accident on the coast highway near Cannon Beach. He was 26 years old. He never knew you were born. By the time the news of his death reached his family, your mother had already moved, changed her last name back to her maiden name, and made it very clear she did not want any contact with anyone connected to him. Marlo felt the floor tilt slightly. My mother knew. Her voice was a whisper. She knew he died. I cannot speak to what she knew or did not know. Walter's voice was very gentle now. I can only speak to what is in this file. And what is in this file is that William's father, your paternal grandfather, a man named Harold Whitmore, made many attempts over the years to locate you. Through me. Through investigators. Through letters that were returned unopened. He never found you. He turned another page. Harold Whitmore passed away 2 months ago in his home in Astoria, Oregon. He was 81 years old. Marlo sat perfectly still. The coffee in the mug had stopped trembling because her hands had gone numb. She had a grandfather. She had had a grandfather. For 18 years. Tell me about him, she said. Walter Bishop folded his hands on top of the manila folder. He took a long, careful breath, the kind of breath a man takes before he tries to describe something he is not sure he understood himself. Harold Whitmore, he said, was one of the most brilliant and one of the most difficult men I ever represented. He was a structural engineer. For 40 years, he worked at a commercial shipyard in Astoria, designing the bracing and the keel work for cargo vessels and fishing trawlers. He retired sometime in the mid-1990s. After he retired, Marlo, he changed. Changed how? He became a recluse. Walter's eyes were steady on her. I do not say that lightly. He stopped seeing his old colleagues. He stopped going to church. He stopped going into town, except to buy groceries. He developed a deep, abiding distrust of banks, of the government, of anyone in a uniform. He believed by the end that the entire financial system was about to collapse and that the only assets a person could truly own were the ones he could touch with his own 2 hands. Walter paused. He was in plain English paranoid. Brilliant, but paranoid. And he was alone. He lost his only son, your father, in that car accident. He never recovered from it. I think in some ways your existence, the idea of you out there somewhere, was the only thing that kept him going. He used to say to me the few times I saw him in his last years, Walter, I have a granddaughter somewhere, and someday she is going to need everything I have left. Walter slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward her. He left you everything, Marlo. She looked down at the page. She did not understand most of the legal language, but she understood the words at the bottom. Sole heir, Marlo Whitmore. A house. A real house. A roof. Walls. A door that locked. A door that no one named Roy Crane could ever stand on the other side of. The thought hit her so hard, she had to set the coffee down before she dropped it. She lifted her eyes to Walter Bishop's face. She could feel the first hot tears collecting at the bottom of them. Mr. Bishop, she said. Her voice cracked in the middle of his name. I have been sleeping on cardboard for 3 weeks. Is there any money? Anything at all? A little bit just to get started. Walter Bishop did not answer right away. He lowered his eyes to the folder. He smoothed the corner of a page with the side of his thumb. When he looked up again, his face had changed. It was not unkind. It was the careful, sorry face of a doctor, about to deliver a diagnosis no one wants to hear. That Marlo, he said quietly, is the part of the story I have been dreading. He turned another page. Your grandfather's bank accounts have been empty for years. His brokerage accounts, which once held a substantial sum, were drained in a series of large cash withdrawals over a period of about a decade. There is no trail. There is no record of where the money went. Some of his old neighbors believe he gambled it away. Some believe he was scammed by a series of con artists, of which there are unfortunately many in coastal Oregon. I do not personally believe either of those theories. But what I believe does not matter. What matters is that the estate on paper is bankrupt. Marlowe's stomach went cold. "There is one more matter," Walter said. He looked at her with something that was almost apology. "The property has not had its taxes paid in 3 years. As of this morning, your grandfather's estate owes Clatsop County the sum of $12,000 in back taxes and penalties. I've already filed the necessary paperwork to extend the deadline as long as I legally can. But the law is the law, Marlowe. You have 60 days. 60 days from today to pay that $12,000, or the county will foreclose on the house. They will sell it at auction, and whatever your grandfather wanted you to have will be gone." She stared at him. The number 12,000 sat in the air between them, like a wall she couldn't climb. She did not have $12. Walter Bishop reached across the desk. He pushed the manila folder toward her. On top of it, he laid a small ring with 2 heavy brass keys. They looked old. They looked like the kind of keys that came with houses built before her mother was born. "This is everything I have for you," he said softly. "The deed, the will, the keys to the front door, and this." He pulled out a long white envelope and set it on top of the keys. "Inside this envelope, Marlowe, is $50. It is not from the estate. It is from me personally. It is enough to buy you a one-way ticket on the Greyhound bus from Portland to Astoria and a meal along the way." Marlowe looked up at him. "Why?" she whispered. "Because your grandfather waited 18 years to give you something." Walter's eyes were very steady. "And I am not going to let you arrive at his front door with empty pockets. Take the keys. Go to Astoria. Look at what he left you. And then come back to me and we will figure out the next step together." She picked up the keys. They were heavier than she had expected. The brass was warm from the office air. She closed her fist around them, and the metal pressed into her palm, hard enough to hurt. For the first time in 22 days, Marlowe Whitmore had a destination. The Greyhound rolled north out of Portland in the late afternoon, the city falling away in her rearview window, replaced by green hills and gray sky, and long straight stretches of Highway 30. Marlowe sat by the window with her backpack on the seat beside her, and her forehead pressed to the cold glass. She watched the Columbia River appear and disappear between curtains of Douglas fir. She watched freight trains crawl along the far bank like long brown caterpillars. She watched the rain come and go and come again. The coffee in her stomach had finally stopped shaking. The croissants had finally stopped feeling like a dream. She let herself imagine for the first time in her life what it would feel like to walk into a house and close the door behind her, and have it be her door. She imagined a small house, white paint, maybe a little weathered, a front porch, a wooden swing on chains, the kind that creaks, a kitchen with a window that looked out at something green. She did not need much. She did not need fancy. She just needed walls. She just needed a door that locked from the inside and stayed locked because she was the one who had locked it. The bus pulled into Astoria a little after 7 in the evening. The town sat at the mouth of the Columbia where the river met the sea and the air smelled of salt and diesel and old wood. The streetlights came on as she stepped down onto the wet pavement. A foghorn moaned somewhere out on the water. Gulls wheeled above the rooftops, screaming at nothing. She had an address on a slip of paper in her pocket. 442 Briarwood Lane. The driver pointed her in the right direction. She walked. It was almost 2 miles. The streets climbed. Astoria was a town built on hills, the houses stacked one above the other, like books on a crooked shelf. Most of them were old. Some of them were beautiful. Some of them looked like they had been beautiful once a long time ago, before the wind and the salt had gotten to them. Briarwood Lane was at the top of a long, dark rise on the east side of town. The streetlights got farther apart as she climbed. The houses got farther apart. The trees got taller, older, leaning over the road like a long green tunnel. Her breath came in white puffs. Her legs ached. She kept walking. And then the trees opened. And Marlowe Whitmore stopped. 40 feet ahead of her, set back behind a sagging iron fence and a driveway choked with weeds, stood the house. It was a Victorian, 3 stories tall, a turret on the right side rising into a peaked witch hat roof, a wraparound porch on the front, tall, narrow windows, the kind of house that had once in some better century been the pride of a hill. Now it was a ruin. The paint had once been gray. Now it hung off the clapboard in long, peeling strips, like the dead skin of some enormous animal. Half the windows on the first floor were broken, the glass jagged where stones or weather had punched through. The other half were boarded over with mismatched plywood. Dark green ivy had climbed up the south side of the house in thick, choking ropes, and Marlowe had the strange, sinking feeling that the ivy was the only thing keeping the porch from collapsing entirely. The roof above the turret was missing dozens of shingles, and the bare wood underneath had gone black with rot. The yard was a jungle, knee-high grass, a rusted swing set with no swings, a stone birdbath cracked in half by a fallen tree limb, a mailbox lying on its side in the weeds. Marlowe stood at the bottom of the driveway and felt the blood drain from her face. This was not a house. This was the corpse of a house. She took a step forward. Her legs felt very far away from her. She walked up the cracked driveway. She climbed the porch steps. The wood groaned under her weight. A piece of the railing came loose in her hand when she reached for it, and she let it fall. The front door was thick, dark wood, scarred and warped. There was a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, green with age. Below it, the lock. She fumbled in her pocket. She drew out the heavy brass key. She had to put her shoulder against the door to make the key turn. The lock had not moved in months. It fought her. Then, with a low, reluctant clunk, it gave. The door swung inward. The smell hit her first. Years of mildew, wet wood, cold dust. Something underneath, faint and animal, that she did not want to identify. The air inside was colder than the air outside, and very still the way the air is still inside a sealed jar. She stepped over the threshold. Her flashlight beam, the cheap plastic one she had bought at a truck stop on the way north, swept across the foyer. A staircase rose to her right, the carpet on its steps eaten through in places, the banister leaning at a drunk angle. To her left, an archway opened into what had once been a parlor. Furniture sat under moth-eaten white sheets, slumped like the ghosts of furniture. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its glass face cracked, its hands frozen at 4:12. Wallpaper hung off the walls in long, peeling sheets. In the kitchen, when she found it, the linoleum was cracked and lifting. The cast iron sink was streaked with rust. She turned a faucet. Nothing. She flicked a light switch. Nothing. The power had been off for years. The water had been off for years. She walked back to the parlor. She stood in the middle of the cold, dark room. She lowered her backpack to the dusty floor. She lowered herself down beside it. She put her face in her hands, and the truth came down on her like a wall. She had crossed an entire state in the back of a Greyhound bus, with the last $50 of a kind old man's money in her pocket, to sit on the floor of a rotting house she did not own and could not afford to keep. The lifeline she had been thrown was not a lifeline. It was a chain. And the chain was attached to a stone, and the stone was sinking, and she was going to sink with it. She cried. She did not cry quietly. She cried the way a person cries when she is finally completely alone with no one to hear and no one to be brave for. She cried until her ribs hurt. She cried until her throat was raw. She cried until the last of the watery gray light bled out of the broken windows and the house was completely perfectly dark. And then, somewhere in the deepest hour of that long, freezing night, while Marlowe sat curled on the dusty floor of the parlor, with a moth-eaten tarp she had pulled out of a pantry wrapped around her shoulders, and the wind moaned through the broken windows of her ruined inheritance, something inside her began very slowly to change. She did not notice it at first. It was not a thought. It was not a decision. It was something older than thought, something that lived in the bones, in the gut, in the small hard place at the base of the spine, where the body decides whether to lie down and die or get up one more time. Her tears stopped. She did not order them to stop. They stopped on their own. She stared dry-eyed now at the dark shape of the grandfather clock across the room. 22 days, she thought. 22 days under cardboard. 22 days of being afraid. 22 days of being no one. And before that, 18 years in a house where the door had a lock that worked against her instead of for her. Whatever else this place was, whatever else it would become, it was hers. The door was hers. The lock was hers. The walls broken and rotten and ivy-choked were hers. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She wrapped the tarp tighter around her shoulders. She lay down on her side on the cold floor with her backpack as a pillow. The wind shifted outside. Somewhere in the upper floors of the house, a loose board groaned and settled. Marlowe Whitmore listened to her ruined kingdom breathing in the dark. She closed her eyes. She slept. Gray light came up slow over Astoria, the kind of light that has to fight its way through fog before it ever reaches the ground. It crept through the broken windows of the parlor. It crawled across the dusty floorboards. It found Marlowe Whitmore curled on her side, her cheek pressed to the rough canvas of her backpack, her breath coming out in small white clouds. She opened her eyes. For a long moment, she did not move. She lay still and watched the light grow and listened to the silence of the house. There were small sounds, a drip of water somewhere upstairs, the settle of old wood, the far-off cry of a gull. The house was no longer terrifying. The house was just old. The house was just hurt. Marlowe sat up slowly. The tarp slid off her shoulders and pooled around her hips. Her whole body ached. Her stomach was a tight, hollow fist. She pushed her tangled hair out of her eyes. She looked around the parlor in the morning light. It was worse than she had thought in some ways. The wallpaper in daylight was a sickly yellow with patches of black mold. The ceiling above her had a long brown stain shaped like a continent. The furniture under the sheets was probably ruined. The fireplace, when she squinted at it, was clogged with old leaves and what might have been a bird's nest. But it was hers. She got to her feet. Her knees creaked. She walked slowly one room at a time through the ground floor of the house. She did not turn on her flashlight. She wanted to see it the way it really looked in honest gray morning light, with no false hope. The kitchen was a disaster. The dining room was worse. There was a small library at the back of the house, its tall built-in bookshelves sagging under the weight of hundreds of moldering books. There was a strange narrow hallway that seemed to lead nowhere. There were ceilings in some rooms that felt almost oppressively low, as if the man who had lived here had been afraid of open space. The whole house felt like the inside of a mind that had not been quiet for a long time. She came back to the parlor. She stood in the middle of it. She closed her eyes. She thought about Roy Crane. She thought about the click of the deadbolt on her mother's front door. She thought about the cardboard in the alley. She thought about the $50 Walter Bishop had pressed into her hand and the brass keys in the faded photograph she did not have of a young man named William Whitmore who had died on the coast highway when he was 26 and never even known her name. She thought about her grandfather, the brilliant, paranoid old man who had waited for her until the day he died. She opened her eyes. She spoke out loud for the first time in many hours, and her voice was rough and small in the cold parlor. "Crying isn't going to fix the roof," she said. She bent down. She picked up her backpack. She slung it onto one shoulder. "And being scared isn't going to put food in my stomach." She walked across the parlor toward the front door. The morning light was getting stronger. Somewhere outside, a foghorn moaned out on the river. Somewhere upstairs in this old, broken, secret-keeping house, something creaked and went still. Marlo Whitmore was 18 years old. She was hungry. She was alone. She was the new owner of a rotting Victorian mansion and $12,000 in unpaid taxes, and exactly 60 days to figure out what to do about any of it. She had no idea. She pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the gray Astoria morning, that the walls of her grandfather's house were hiding a secret worth more money than she had ever imagined existing in the world. She had no idea that someone else already knew that secret was there. She had no idea that within 72 hours a man she had never met would be sitting in a dark pickup truck at the bottom of her driveway with a key in his pocket and murder on his mind, waiting for the exact right moment to come inside. She only knew as she stood on her sagging front porch and pulled the heavy door closed behind her and turned the brass key in the lock with her own 2 hands, that she was not going to die in this house. Not yet. Not today. The first thing she did was walk. Marlo Whitmore came down the long hill of Briarwood Lane on her own 2 legs that gray. Astoria morning, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The brass keys to a dead man's house jingling in the front pocket of her jeans. She had $11.43 in cash. A cheap plastic flashlight with one good battery left in it. And a stomach so empty it had stopped complaining and started simply aching the way a bruise aches. The town opened up in front of her as she descended. Astoria sat in tears, the houses stacked down the hillside toward the wide gray mouth of the Columbia. She passed Victorian homes that were still loved with fresh paint and trimmed hedges, and she did not look at them. Looking at them hurt. She passed a corner store with a hand-lettered sign in the window. She passed a bait shop. She passed a coffee place where 2 old fishermen were sitting on the sidewalk bench, drinking from paper cups, their boots wet with morning dew. One of them looked up at her as she walked by. He had a face like a piece of weathered driftwood, all lines and salt and patient eyes. He nodded at her just once. A small acknowledgement. "I see you. I am not going to bother you." "Good morning." Marlo nodded back. It was the first kind thing a stranger had done for her in a long time, and it nearly knocked the wind out of her. She kept walking before he could see the wet at the edges of her eyes. She found a small grocery at the bottom of the hill. She bought a loaf of plain white bread, a jar of generic peanut butter, a quart of bottled water, and a single banana that was already turning brown. The total came to $7.82. The cashier, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with a tag on her apron that said, Marge, looked at her face for a long moment as she counted out the change. "You okay, honey?" Marge asked. Her voice was low, not pity, concern. "Yes, ma'am," Marlo said. "I'm fine." Marge did not look convinced. She slid an extra apple across the counter. A red one, polished. She did not ring it up. "On the house," Marge said. "Don't argue." Marlowe did not argue. She put the apple in her bag with the rest. She said thank you in a voice she could barely keep together. She walked out of the store and around the corner of the building before she let herself stop and breathe. People were not all bad. She had to remember that. She had to remember that most days the world was not Roy Crane. Most days the world was a tired woman named Marge who slid an apple across a counter and did not say anything else about it. She walked back up the long hill to the house. The morning had brightened by the time she reached the top of Briarwood Lane. Pale sunlight was burning the fog off the rooftops in patches, and the Victorian on its overgrown lot looked in this thin light even worse than it had the night before. The peeling gray paint, the broken windows, the ivy crawling up the south side like green claws. But it was hers. She climbed the porch steps. She turned the key in the lock. The deadbolt clunked over. She pushed the heavy door open with her shoulder, walked inside, and pulled it shut behind her. The first thing she did was sit on the dusty floor of the parlor and eat. She made herself 2 thick peanut butter sandwiches, one after the other, and washed them down with bottled water, and ate the brown banana, and did not eat the apple because she was saving it. She sat very still while she ate. She listened to the house around her. She tried to learn its sounds, the drip in the back somewhere, the settle of the wood, the wind moving across the broken windows of the upper floors and making the whole structure breathe. When she had finished, she felt the food hit her stomach and spread warmth into her arms and legs. For a few minutes, she felt almost human. Then she got to work. She had no electricity, no water, no money for a hotel, no money for a bus back to Portland, no plan beyond the next 24 hours. The only thing she had on this gray morning was a roof. The roof leaked. But it was a roof. And if she was going to lose it in 58 days, she was going to spend those 58 days underneath it, awake. The first priority was warmth. The October wind off the Columbia was already finding the broken windows and slicing through the parlor. But the cold would be brutal. She walked the ground floor again, slower this time in the daylight, looking for anything that could burn. The library at the back of the house caught her eye. The books were ruined. But the bookshelves themselves, those tall built-in oak monsters that lined 3 walls of the room, were dry on the inside. Solid wood, old-growth oak. A man could heat a house for a winter on what was inside this room. The second priority was a tool. She found her tool in the parlor, leaning against the cold stone of the fireplace. A heavy iron poker 30 inches long, the tip blackened and the handle wrapped in tarnished brass wire. It had a satisfying weight in her palm. It was a tool. It was if it had to be a weapon. She carried the poker into the library and stood looking at the great oak shelves. The first day passed mostly that way in slow, careful work. She used the poker like a crowbar to pry loose the rotted molding around the edges of the shelves. She broke the punkier wood into kindling on the hearth. She built a small, careful fire in the parlor fireplace, using pages from the ruined books as starter. The chimney drew miraculously. The smoke went up and the heat came down. By the time the first dim afternoon began to fade outside, the parlor was the warmest room she had been in for a month. She slept that night wrapped in the old tarp on the floor in front of the dying fire. She slept hard. She dreamed of nothing. The second day was the same. She fed the fire. She rationed the bread. She walked once more into town this time, to a thrift store, where she spent $4 on a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar and somebody else's grandmother. She walked back. She kept walking past the locked front door of her own house, and then back to it, and turning the brass key in the lock just to feel it click, just to remind herself that the door was hers. The third day was the day everything changed. It started with the hunger. She had been rationing the bread and peanut butter for 48 hours, and on the morning of the third day, she stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at what was left in her grocery bag and understood very clearly that it would not last another full day. She had no money for more food. She had no money for fresh wood, even if there had been any to buy. She had a poker, a tarp, a wool blanket, a flashlight running low on its last battery, and a house full of rotting furniture. She also had a stomach that was beginning to cramp, with a low, twisting pain she had felt only once before in the second week on the streets, and never wanted to feel again. She picked up the iron poker. She walked back to the library. The biggest of the built-in bookshelves stood against the back wall of the room. It was 8 feet tall and 10 feet wide, a single massive piece of oak that had been built into the house when the house was built sometime in the 1890s. The shelves were sagging. Most of the books on them were soft with mildew, but the structure itself, the great oak skeleton, was still solid. There was firewood in that one piece of furniture to last her a week. She wedged the tip of the iron poker behind the corner of the shelf in the seam where the oak met the baseboard. She set her boots against the floor. She threw her weight against the handle. The wood groaned. Nothing moved. She tried again. She put her shoulder into it. The poker slipped. She stumbled forward and skinned her knuckle on the rough oak. She sat back on her heels. She wiped sweat off her forehead with the back of her wrist. She breathed. She tried a third time. This time, she planted her feet wider. She wrapped both hands around the poker. She bent her knees. She pushed up and out the way a man pushes a stalled pickup truck out of the mud, with his whole body, with everything he had. The oak gave with a violent, splintering crack. A great section of the bookshelf lurched out from the wall. The base molding split along its length. Marlowe stumbled backward, coughing as a thick gray cloud of ancient dust came boiling out of the gap and rolled across the library floor. She covered her mouth with her sleeve. She waited, eyes streaming for the dust to settle. When it did, she lowered her sleeve. She stared at what she had uncovered. It was not just a space behind the bookshelf. It was not just the empty cavity between 2 studs that she had expected. The wall behind the bookshelf had been deliberately built out, and the inside of the false wall was lined top to bottom with dull gray sheets of zinc. Zinc, Marlowe thought through the cotton in her head. Zinc keeps moisture out. Zinc keeps rats out. Zinc keeps the years out. Sitting on the floor of the zinc-lined cavity square in the middle was a heavy, dark green metal box about the size of a microwave oven. The box was sealed with a thick brass padlock, the kind a man buys when he does not trust ordinary locks. Even in the dim afternoon light filtering through the boarded windows, she could see the box was old. The paint was scratched in places. The corners were dented. Her breath stopped. For a long moment, Marlowe could not move. She knelt on the dusty floor of the library, her grandfather's library, and stared at the green metal box in its hidden zinc-lined nest. And the only sound in the world was the slow, steady drip of water somewhere upstairs. Then she crawled forward. She reached into the cavity with both hands. The box was heavier than it looked. She had to brace one knee against the broken baseboard to drag it out. The metal was cold and very slightly greasy under her palms, the way old metal gets when it has been sealed away from the air for a long time. She pulled it free of the wall and let it down careful on the dusty oak floorboards in front of her. She sat back on her heels. She picked up the iron poker. She had to stand to do it. She had to plant the box against the floor with her boot and bring the poker down on the brass padlock the way a man chops wood. The first blow rang loud and ugly in the empty library, and she flinched at the sound of it, half expecting to hear a distant siren or a shout from the road. Nothing. The house ate the sound. She struck again, and again, and again. The brass body of the lock began to dent. On the fifth strike, something inside the lock gave with a sharp metallic snap, and the shackle popped free. She dropped the poker. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. She knelt down. Her hands were shaking. She had to stop and breathe before she could lift the lid. She remembered very strangely the feel of the 18th birthday card she had bought for herself at the drugstore in Portland. How its cardboard had crumpled in her fist. How nobody had said her name that day. The same hands were shaking now. The same girl. A different birthday card. She lifted the lid. The smell came out first. Dry paper and old metal, and the very faint, very particular green smell of money that has been stored a long time. She knew that smell. Everyone knows that smell. The first thing she saw was the cash. It was in stacks, bundled with old brittle rubber bands, pale green. $100 bills, the older series, with the smaller portrait, the ones with crisp engraved corners. Her right hand reached in before her brain had caught up with what her eyes were seeing. She lifted out a single bundle. The rubber band crackled and broke under her thumb. The bills fanned out across her palm. She counted them slowly with shaking fingers, the way a child counts a birthday gift. 10 bills, $1,000 in her hand. She set the bundle down on the floor beside her. She reached back into the box. Another bundle. Another 1,000. A third bundle. 1,000. A fourth. A fifth. $5,000. She sat on the floor of her grandfather's library with $5,000 in cash, spread on the dusty oak in front of her. And she did not cheer, and she did not laugh, and she did not cry. She made a small sound she did not have a name for. A short, hard exhale that was not quite a sob, and not quite a prayer. $5,000 was not $12,000. She still owed Clatsop County $12,000 in 57 days. $5,000 would not save the house, but it would save her. It would buy locks. It would buy food. It would buy a winter coat that was not a wet denim jacket. It would buy time. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, and she realized in surprise that her face was wet. She had not noticed she was crying. She looked back into the green metal box. The cash had been on top. Underneath it, sitting on a layer of brittle waxed paper, was a thick, leather-bound book. She lifted it out. The leather was black and very supple and softer than she expected, the way old, well-handled leather always is. There was no title on the spine. No marking on the cover. Just the worn dent of a man's thumb, where it had been opened 1,000 times. She set the book on her lap. She opened it. The pages were filled top to bottom, edge to edge, with a man's handwriting. The handwriting was not the careful, even script of an engineer. The handwriting was something stranger. It was jagged in places. It was cramped in others. It tilted forward, then back, then forward again, like a man who had been writing while afraid. There were architectural diagrams interleaved between the paragraphs of text. There were strings of numbers in the margins. There were words that had been underlined 2 and 3 and 4 times with such pressure that the pen had nearly gone through the paper. Marlowe turned to the front of the book. The first entry was dated October the 14th, 2007. The handwriting was tighter then, steadier. The voice on the page was the voice of a man who had not yet completely lost his hold on the world, but who had felt the rope beginning to slip. She read, "They think I lost it. They think the markets took it all. fools. A bank is just a house you don't own. I own this house. I own the walls. I own the floor. I own the foundation. The foundation is a lie. The blueprint is the map. She turned the page. She read for a long time. The light outside the library windows began to change. The thin afternoon shifted toward evening. Marlo Whitmore did not move. She sat on the floor of her grandfather's library with $5,000 beside her and the dead man's journal in her lap, and she met him for the first time. His name had been Harold Whitmore. He had been a structural engineer at the commercial shipyard in Astoria for 41 years. He had loved his wife, a woman named Ellen, who had died of pancreatic cancer in 1991, 4 years before he retired. He had loved his son, a young man named William, who had been killed on the Coast Highway in 2006 in a car accident that Harold, in the long, dark years that followed, had never quite been able to accept as an accident. After he lost his son, Harold, Whitmore had begun to come apart. She read it in his handwriting. She read it in the way the entries grew more erratic over the years. She read it in the way the architectural diagrams got more elaborate and more secretive until they were no longer diagrams of structures he was working on, but diagrams of his own house, his own walls, his own floors. She read it in the way the same phrases came back again and again on different pages in different inks. The blueprint is the map. The first 5 is for the finder. The rest is for the worthy. A bank is just a house you don't own. He had not trusted banks. He had not trusted brokers. He had not trusted the federal government or the local government or the post office or the neighbors. He had trusted only one thing in the world, and that was the house itself. The great rotting Victorian on Briarwood Lane that he and Ellen had bought together in 1976. Over the course of about a decade, Harold Whitmore had quietly, methodically, paranoidly liquidated almost everything he owned. His brokerage accounts, his retirement fund, his wife's old bond portfolio. He had converted his entire life savings into something he could carry, something he could touch, something no banker and no government could vanish with a keystroke. And he had hidden it in his house. Marlo turned to the page she had been heading toward without quite knowing it. There was a careful, steady-handed diagram of the very library she was sitting in, the bookshelves, the fireplace, the window, and a single dotted line drawn in black ink that began behind the bookshelf, where she had broken through and ran along the inside of the wall, and then turned and then descended, and then disappeared off the bottom of the page toward the center of the house, toward something Harold Whitmore had not yet drawn. Beside the diagram, underlined twice, were the words she had been waiting to read. The first 5 is for the finder. The rest is for the worthy. $5,000. The first 5,000 was a tip. It was a token. It was what Harold Whitmore had left for whoever happened to find this box. It was bait. The rest of it, whatever the rest of it was, he had left for the worthy. Marlo Whitmore lowered the journal slowly to her lap. She raised her eyes to the long, dark shape of the bookshelf she had broken open. She let her gaze travel along the wall and then to the floor, and then down into the boards of the library, into the unseen space beneath them. Her grandfather had not died. Broke. Her grandfather had died sitting on top of a fortune. The fortune was still in the house. And by the way, the dotted line ran on the diagram in his journal. The fortune was almost directly under her feet. She sat for a long time with that thought. The library was nearly dark now. Outside the boarded windows, the gray afternoon had bled away into a colder gray evening, and the wind off the Columbia had picked up. And somewhere upstairs in the house, a loose shutter banged against a wall and went still and banged again. She closed the journal carefully. She pressed the leather to her chest, the way a child presses a teddy bear. "Grandfather," she said out loud to the empty library, to the man she had never met. Her voice was small and very steady. "I'm going to find it." The first thing she did was hide the box. She wrapped the cash in a section of dry waxed paper from the bottom of the green metal container. She separated it into 2 stacks. She slid one stack $2,500 into the inside pocket of her denim jacket. She slid the other stack in a tight roll deep into the toe of her left boot under the wool sock. She returned the journal to the metal box. She set the box back into its zinc-lined cavity behind the bookshelf. She pushed the broken section of bookshelf back into place as best she could, and dragged a moth-eaten armchair from the parlor in front of it and threw a sheet over the chair, and stood back and looked and decided that someone who did not know to look would not look. Then she walked down the hill into Astoria for the 3rd time. This time the walk felt different. This time there was the soft secret weight of money against her ribs, and the harder secret weight of paper money in her boot, and a different kind of weight on her shoulders, the weight of a plan. She went to the hardware store first, a small place, family-owned, with a bell that jingled when the door opened. The man behind the counter was about 60, with a heavy gray mustache and a green vest. He glanced up at her when she came in, and his eyes flicked over her wet jacket and her tangled hair. And Marlowe braced herself for the way she had been looked at in too many stores in too many towns. But he just nodded, the same way the old fisherman that morning had nodded. "Help you find something," he said. She had a list. She had written it carefully on a torn piece of brown paper grocery bag. She read it to him. A heavy-duty deadbolt, 2 of them if he had them, a crowbar, a claw hammer, a box of long screws, a package of wood screws, 2 heavy battery-powered LED lanterns, the bright kind, the kind contractors used, spare batteries, a pair of leather work gloves in a small size, a cheap prepaid cell phone, the kind you topped up with cards. The man with the gray mustache listened. He did not ask why an 18-year-old girl in a wet jacket needed 2 deadbolts and a crowbar. He just walked out from behind his counter and walked her down each of his 3 short aisles, picking the items up and putting them in a basket one by one. When she pulled out the cash to pay, his eyes registered the money. He did not say anything about that either. He rang her up. The total was $217.90. She paid in older hundreds. He examined one bill briefly under the light, then nodded and put them in his drawer. "You out at one of the old houses up on Briarwood?" he asked as he was sliding her items into 2 brown paper sacks. She hesitated. "Yes, sir." "Whitmore Place." She froze. The man's face did not change. There was no malice in it. There was no greed. There was just the calm, professional curiosity of a small-town hardware man who had been selling nails to the same hill for 30 years. "Yes, sir," she said again very quietly. He nodded slowly. "Thought I recognized something about your face. You favor him around the eyes." Marlowe's throat closed up. "Harold Whitmore was one of the finest men I ever met," the hardware man said. He said it simply the way a man states a fact he is sure of. "He was harder than a winter clam toward the end, but he was a good man. I was sorry to hear he passed. You take care of yourself out there, miss. That is a big house for one person." He pushed her bags across the counter. He did not say anything else. Marlowe walked out of the hardware store with hot, full eyes and 2 heavy paper sacks in her arms. She stopped on the sidewalk. She turned her face up into the cold mist and let it cool her cheeks. "You favor him around the eyes." She had a face that someone in this town recognized. She had a name that meant something to a man behind a counter. After 18 years of being nobody, of being Roy Crane's leftover, of being the unwanted thing, she had walked into a hardware store in Astoria, and a stranger had looked at her face and seen her grandfather. She walked next to a small diner on the corner of Marine Drive. She sat at the counter. She ordered a cheeseburger and fries and a hot black coffee. She ate slowly. The food hit her stomach like a benediction. The waitress, an older woman with red hair, refilled her coffee twice without being asked. Marlo paid. She tipped well. She walked back up the long hill to the house, the brown paper sacks heavy in her arms, the new deadbolts shifting their weight against each other inside. She worked through the rest of that afternoon and into the early evening. She installed the new deadbolt on the front door, drilling out the old worn brass and seating the new steel mechanism deep in the doorframe. She hammered heavy boards across the broken window beside the front door, layering them, screwing them down hard. She did the same to two of the broken windows in the parlor. She lit the lanterns. The library and the parlor and the kitchen filled with cold white light, brighter than the house had been lit in years. When she was done, the house felt different. It felt closed. It felt sealed. It felt for the first time like a thing that could keep something out. She made herself a meal. Bread, peanut butter, a new can of soup she had bought eaten cold from the can with a plastic spoon. She sat in front of the small fire she rebuilt in the parlor fireplace. She unrolled her new wool blanket on the floor. She was beginning to think for the first time that she might survive this. That was when she heard the tires. It was full dark by then, somewhere after 9 in the evening. The wind had risen outside, and the rain had started again, a thin, steady drizzle that hissed against the boarded windows. Marlo was sitting on the wool blanket by the fire, the leather journal open on her knees, reading by the white glow of the LED lantern. She had been reading the same passage for the third time. The roots hold the tree. Water flows down. Heat rises up. The false floor breathes where the coal once slept. She did not understand it yet, but she was beginning to feel that she would. She was so deep in the reading that the sound, when it came, registered late. It registered as something that did not belong. And then her brain caught up. Tires, crunching slow on wet gravel, coming up her driveway. Marlo's whole body went still. She closed the journal. She set it down on the blanket. She blew out the lantern and the parlor fell into darkness, lit only by the low orange glow of the dying fire. She moved on her hands and knees across the floor, the wool blanket around her shoulders, and she crawled to the front window and pressed her cheek to the boards she had nailed up that afternoon. There was a small crack between two of the boards. She put her eye to it. Headlights cut across the driveway. They came up slow. Then they cut out. A dark pickup truck sat at the bottom of the drive, parked just past the broken iron gate, its engine ticking as it cooled. There was no license plate on the front bumper. Marlo could not see if there was one on the back. The rain blurred everything. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall. He wore a heavy dark raincoat with the collar turned up high against the rain. He had a flashlight in one hand, but he did not turn it on. He stood for a moment beside the truck, looking up at the dark, sealed face of the house, his head tilting slightly, the way a man tilts his head when he is listening for something. Then he started walking up the driveway. Marlo's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Her right hand reached out very slowly in the dark and closed around the handle of the iron poker she had left leaning against the parlor wall. She drew it to her soundless and laid it across her knees. The man came up the porch steps. The wood groaned under his boots. He did not pause at the porch railing. He did not look around to see if he was being watched. He walked straight to the front door. the way a man walks who has been to a place before and knew exactly where the door was. She heard him stop in front of the door. She heard a small metallic sound, a soft, careful sound. The sound of a man taking something out of a coat pocket. The sound of a key sliding into a brass lock. Marlowe stopped breathing. The handle of the front door jiggled. Once, twice, hard. The door did not open. Marlowe had replaced the lock that afternoon. The man's key fit the old brass mechanism that was no longer in the door. The new steel deadbolt held. A man's voice came through the door, low, furious, just loud enough to carry through the wood. "Damn it, Bishop." Marlowe's blood turned to ice water. Bishop. The man on the porch had cursed the name Bishop. He had said it the way a son curses a father who has ruined his plan. The man stepped back from the door. His boots moved off the porch. She could hear him circling. He walked along the front of the house, his footsteps muffled in the wet grass. He paused at the boarded window. He pushed at it with his hand. The boards held. He moved on. Marlowe crawled slow as a cat across the parlor floor toward the next window. She heard him reach the side of the house. She heard the soft, careful sound of glass crunching under a boot. He had found the window beside the front door, the one she had not gotten to yet, the one that was already broken. She heard him reach his arm in. She heard the brass deadbolt of the old door, the one she had not removed because it was decorative, slide back uselessly. The new steel one above it held. She heard him curse again, low, tight. She heard him step back. There was a pause. Then she heard the unmistakable, ugly sound of a man's elbow driving through plate glass. Glass burst inward across the parlor floor. A spray of cold rain came in with it. The boarded window beside the door had not been one window after all, it had been two. And he had simply moved to the second. He reached his arm in again. His sleeve scraped on the broken glass. Marlowe heard him fumbling for the deadbolt. She rolled silent into the deep shadow behind the parlor's heavy, moth-eaten couch. She crouched. She brought the iron poker up against her shoulder. Her hands had stopped shaking. She did not know when they had stopped. They had simply stopped. The deadbolt above turned, then the deadbolt below. He had reached up high and gotten the new lock too by feel in the rain in the dark. The front door swung open. A flashlight beam cut into the foyer. It swept across the parlor and missed her hiding spot behind the couch by less than a foot. Boots crossed the threshold, heavy, confident. The boots of a man who believed he was alone. He stepped fully into the parlor. The dying fire painted half his face in dim orange light. Marlowe saw him for the first time. He was younger than she had expected, late 20s, maybe early 30s, clean-shaven, dark hair combed neatly back from a high forehead. The dark raincoat was open now, and beneath it she could see a tailored gray suit and a striped tie loosened at the collar. He did not look like a burglar. He did not look like a junkie. He looked like a man who worked in an office tower in downtown Portland. He looked around the eyes and the line of the jaw very faintly, like the older man who had bought her breakfast 3 days ago in an oak-paneled office on Southwest 6th Avenue. The man pulled out a smartphone. He hit a single button and put it to his ear. He spoke quietly, but in the empty parlor. His voice carried like a stone dropped into a well. "Yeah, I'm inside." A pause. Marlowe pressed herself flatter against the back of the couch. She could not breathe. She could only listen. "My father changed the locks, the old fool. But the homeless girl isn't here yet. I checked the local shelters. Nobody's seen an 18-year-old matching her description. I have a few days before she shows up to claim the property to find the central cache." Another pause. The man laughed short and sharp. The old man was paranoid as hell. Whitmore, the old lunatic. The notes in the probate file said he pulled almost $3 million out of his brokerage accounts in the last decade of his life. $3 million in cash. He didn't trust banks. It has to be in the walls. I'm checking the load-bearing structures now. He took a step backward into the room. He stepped onto the moth-eaten Persian rug in the center of the parlor floor. Marlowe had been in this house for 3 days. She had walked across that rug a dozen times. She had walked carefully because she had learned on her second day that the floorboards directly beneath that rug had been almost completely eaten through by 60 years of dry rot. She had learned to step around it. She had learned exactly where to put her feet. The man on the rug had not learned any of that. His weight came down. The floor gave with a sickening, splintering crack. His right leg punched straight through the rotten boards up to mid-thigh. In a violent shower of broken oak and ancient plaster dust, his flashlight flew out of his hand. It tumbled across the parlor and shattered against the cold stone of the fireplace. The room dropped instantly into pitch blackness. He screamed. The smartphone clattered out of his other hand and skittered across the floor. He thrashed. The broken floorboards bit into his thigh. He cursed the words coming out ragged and panicked. My leg is stuck. Damn it, damn it, damn it. In the absolute dark of the parlor behind the moth-eaten couch, with the iron poker hard against her shoulder, and her grandfather's secret pressed against her ribs, in the inside pocket of her denim jacket, Marlowe Whitmore did not move. She did not stand up. She did not announce herself. She did not try to be a hero. She had learned something on the streets of Portland that boys in expensive raincoats had not learned in their offices. She had learned that when a violent man is hurt and afraid in the dark, the smartest thing a smaller person can do is become invisible. She closed her hand around the iron poker. She slid backward on her knees on her elbows, soundless an inch at a time away from the couch across the parlor, into the deeper shadow of the foyer. She crawled past the open front door. She crawled into the narrow servant's pantry beneath the main staircase. She pulled the pantry door shut behind her. There was a small hook latch on the inside of the door. She slid it home. She curled into a ball on the cold floorboards of the pantry, the cash against her ribs, the iron poker across her chest, the wool blanket forgotten somewhere out in the parlor. She listened. For 20 long minutes, she listened to a stranger named Bishop, who was the son of the only adult in the world who had been kind to her curse and grunt and bleed in the dark of her grandfather's parlor. She listened to him drag himself out of the broken floor. She listened to him limp across the foyer. She listened to him stop in the open doorway and breathe hard and curse her grandfather, curse his own father. By name, she listened to him stagger down the porch steps and across the wet grass and back to the truck. She listened to the engine roar to life. She listened to the tires spin angrily in the gravel. She listened to the sound of him driving away into the rain down the long, dark hill away from the house. She did not move, not for a long time. Eventually, gray light began to creep very slowly around the edges of the pantry door. Morning was coming. The longest night of her life was ending. Marlowe Whitmore, 18 years old, sat in the dark under the staircase of a rotting Victorian mansion in Astoria, Oregon, with $5,000 in cash on her body and a dead man's journal open in her memory. She thought about what she had read. The false floor breathes where the coal once slept. She understood now. She understood completely. The rest of the money. The real money. The thing Harold Whitmore had left for the worthy. It was not in the walls. It was under the house. The morning came up gray and slow over the rooftops of Astoria. the same way it had every morning of Marlo Whitmore's short, hard life in this house. But this morning was different. This morning, when she pushed open the door of the pantry beneath the staircase and stepped out into the cold gray hallway, she did not move like a girl who was afraid. She moved like a girl who was hunting. She walked through the foyer first. She stopped at the open front door, the door the man named Bishop had left swinging on its hinges in his pain and his hurry, and she pulled it shut. The new deadbolt clunked over under her hand. She stood for a long moment with her palm flat against the wood, and she let the silence of the house settle around her. The wind had died some time before dawn. The rain had stopped. The whole house was quiet the way a battlefield is quiet the morning after. Then she walked into the parlor. The damage was bad. The Persian rug lay torn and sunken, and beneath it the splintered hole in the floor gaped like a mouth jagged with broken oak. There was blood on the edges of the broken boards, not a lot, just enough to confirm what she already knew. The man named Bishop had cut himself on the way out of his trap. He had bled into her floor. He had left a piece of himself behind. Marlo knelt beside the hole. She studied the blood. She studied the dust. She studied the way the rotten boards had given. She thought about the man's voice on the phone. He didn't trust banks. It has to be in the walls. He had been wrong. He had been close, but he had been wrong. The walls were the bait. Her grandfather's library cavity, the green metal box, the $5,000 in older hundreds, all of it had been a careful little decoy, set up by a careful paranoid old engineer to throw off exactly the kind of man who had walked into her parlor last night. A man in a tailored suit who read probate files and thought he was clever. A man who would find the wall cash, take it and leave. The real money was under the house. Marlo stood up. She walked to the leather journal she had hidden under the wool blanket the night before. She picked it up. She turned to the page she had been reading when the tires came up the drive. The roots hold the tree. Water flows down. Heat rises up. The false floor breathes where the coal once slept. She turned the next page. There was a new diagram. She had not gotten to it the night before. Her grandfather's handwriting was tighter on this page, more controlled the way a man's handwriting gets when he is drawing something important, and he wants the reader to follow him exactly. The diagram was the basement. She had not been into the basement of the Whitmore house. She had not even known there was one. She had walked the ground floor a dozen times, and there was no basement door anywhere that she had seen. No staircase down. No cellar hatch in the kitchen. Nothing. But the diagram was very clear. There was a basement. It ran the entire footprint of the house, and the way you got down to it was through a narrow door, hidden behind a panel of wainscoting in a small alcove off the back hallway. Her grandfather had drawn the panel. He had drawn the trick latch behind it. He had drawn an arrow in blue ink pointing to a single small detail at the top of the panel that had to be pressed in a particular way. Marlo took the journal. She took the iron poker. She took her crowbar from the hardware bag in the kitchen. She took the brighter of the two LED lanterns and a fresh set of batteries in her jacket pocket. She walked out of the parlor and down the back hallway past the rotting servant's stair, past the empty back parlor into the small, dim alcove that ended in a wall of old wainscoting that she had walked past a dozen times without seeing what it really was. She set the lantern on the floor. She studied the wainscoting. In the strong white light with the journal open in her hand, she could see what she had not been able to see before. Most of the panels were nailed flush. One of them, the third from the left, was very slightly proud of the others. 1/16 of an inch. A man could have rubbed his hand across this wall every day for 10 years and never noticed. She placed her palm flat against the panel where her grandfather had drawn the arrow. She pushed. The panel pressed inward by half an inch. There was a soft, oiled metal click from somewhere inside the wall. The whole section of wainscoting eased outward toward her on a hidden hinge, and a draft of air came up out of the dark behind it. The air was cold. It was thick. It smelled of damp earth and old iron and something that had not been disturbed in a long, long time. A wooden staircase, narrow and steep, descended into blackness. Marlo Whitmore picked up her lantern. She picked up her iron poker. She set the leather journal on the top step where she could come back to it. She put one boot on the first stair and then the next and the next. She went down into her grandfather's basement. The stairs creaked, but they held. They had been built by a structural engineer, and a structural engineer's stairs do not give way. At the bottom, the lantern beam swept out across a vast, low-ceilinged space that ran the entire length of the house above. The basement was massive. The walls were stone, the old kind fieldstone laid up in mortar by a craftsman who had known what he was doing 120 years ago. The floor was hard-packed earth in some places and concrete in others. The ceiling above her was a forest of heavy oak joists, the bones of the house she had been living in. The basement was a labyrinth. It was packed end to end with the things a paranoid man had hauled down here over 40 years and never thrown away. Stacks of yellowing newspapers as tall as she was tied with twine. 3 broken grandfather clocks lying on their sides. A row of mason jars on a wooden shelf, full of something dark she did not look at twice. An old workbench, a cabinet of woodworking tools, a row of empty paint cans, a folded American flag in a triangular case sitting on top of a stack of leather-bound atlases. Marlo did not let herself look at any of it. She did not have time to know her grandfather. Not yet. She walked the length of the basement. She kept the lantern beam ahead of her. She moved past the clutter to the far corner where the walls met at the back of the house, where the air got coldest and the smell of damp earth was strongest. There it was, the coal chute. It was exactly the way it had been drawn in the journal. A great brick enclosure taller than she was set into the back wall of the basement. The bricks were the dark red of the 1890s. The mortar was crumbling at the edges. There was an iron door set into the front of the enclosure the size of a small oven door. It was welded shut. 40 years of cobweb and dust and dead spider had grown over it. No coal had been delivered to this house since long before Marlo Whitmore had been born. She stepped into the brick enclosure. The space was tight. She could touch both side walls with her elbows. The lantern light bounced off the rough red brick around her. She turned slowly. She studied the back wall of the chute, the wall that should have been the foundation of the house, the wall that her grandfather's diagram said was not what it pretended to be. She read the journal in her head. She had memorized the numbers. 4, 12, 9, 27. The numbers had not been a combination. There was no dial down here. There was no padlock. The numbers were coordinates. They were a pattern of bricks. She knelt down. She put her hand on the bottom row of brick. She counted up slow with her gloved fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4. The 4th row from the floor. She counted across. She did it twice to be sure. The first number, 12 from the left. She pressed. The brick was solid. It did not give. She tried again. She pressed harder. She put her shoulder into it. The brick was as immovable as the rest of the wall. A small, cold worm of doubt began to move in her chest. She had been wrong. She had read the journal wrong. The man in the journal had been a paranoid lunatic who had drained his accounts and lost his mind. And there was nothing down here. No fortune, no vault. Only an old coal chute in an old basement. in an old house she still could not afford to keep. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She thought. 4, 12, 9, 27. The first two numbers did not work as coordinates, so they were not coordinates. They were something else. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about a man who had loved his only son. She thought about a man whose son had been killed at 26 on the coast highway. She thought about how a paranoid old engineer might encode the most important number in his life into the only place no thief would ever look. She opened her eyes. September the 27th. September was the 9th month. The 27th day. 9/27. Her father's birthday. William Whitmore, a young man Marlowe had never met who had died 17 years ago on the coast highway, and whose name his father had never stopped writing. The numbers 4 and 12 were something else. A different date. She understood suddenly with a small, clean shock what the date was. April the 12th. Her grandmother's birthday, almost certainly. Ellen Whitmore, who had died of pancreatic cancer in 1991. The two people Harold Whitmore had loved most in the world. 2 dates, 2 locks, 2 presses. Marlowe knelt back down at the brick wall. She counted again. This time she did it differently. April the 12th, 4 up, 12 over. She placed her gloved thumb on the brick and pressed straight in hard with the heel of her hand behind it. There was a click. Soft, mechanical. Somewhere inside the wall. She did not stop. She did not get up. She moved her hand. September the 27th. 9 across. 7 down. She pressed the second brick. A second click deeper lower in the wall. A long, rumbling vibration began under her boots. It moved up through her body, through the soles of her feet, into her teeth. The whole back wall of the brick enclosure, the whole wall a slab of masonry that must have weighed half a ton, began very slowly to swing inward on hidden hinges. Marlowe stumbled backward. She raised the lantern. A doorway opened in the back of the coal chute. The wall had not been a wall. It had been a door. Cold, dry air came rolling out of the dark space beyond it. The kind of cold, dry air that is kept by a sealed room over many years. The lantern beam pushed in past her, and Marlowe Whitmore looked into what her grandfather had spent the last decade of his life building. It was a vault. It was small. Maybe 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall. The walls were not stone. They were poured concrete reinforced. She could see the steel rebar where one corner had been finished rough. The floor was concrete too. The ceiling was concrete. It was a box within a box, an engineer's vault built by a man who had known exactly what he was doing. Industrial steel shelving lined both side walls, floor to ceiling. The shelves were full. For a long moment, Marlowe could not move. She stood in the doorway of the vault, and her brain refused to take in what her eyes were showing her. The lantern beam moved across the shelves. Dull yellow. Heavy yellow. Brick after brick of it stacked in neat rows, the way a baker stacks loaves. Gold. Gold bullion. Bars of it. Some of them were small, the size of a pack of cigarettes. Some of them were larger, the size of a paperback book. They sat on the shelves in row after row, unmoving, undisturbed, untouched, in the perfect, cold, dry quiet of a sealed room beneath a rotting house in a small Oregon town. She stepped inside the vault. She reached out with her gloved hand. She touched the top bar on the nearest shelf. It was heavier than she had expected. Cold. Solid. The face of the bar was stamped with letters and numbers and a small refiner's mark she could not read in the dim light. She closed her eyes. She counted. Slowly, carefully, she counted what was on the shelves around her. She counted bars. She counted shelves. She did the math in her head the way her grandfather, a structural engineer, had probably done it 1,000 times in this very room. There were hundreds of bars. She did not know the price of gold. She did not know what spot price was that morning in Astoria, Oregon. But she knew enough to know what she was looking at. She was looking at millions of dollars. She was looking almost certainly at the $3 million Harold Whitmore had pulled out of his brokerage accounts, a slow handful at a time, over a slow handful of years, converted into the only kind of asset he had been willing to trust at the end. She was looking at her grandfather's life, the $12,000 in unpaid taxes that had been a wall she could not climb was not a wall anymore. It was less than a fraction of a single bar on these shelves. The county could be paid by lunch. The roof could be fixed by the end of the week. She would never sleep on cardboard again. She would never again stand in a doorway watching her mother refuse to look up. She was rich. She was safe. She put both hands on the top shelf. She lowered her forehead to the cold, dull yellow of the metal. And for the first time in her 18 years on this earth, Marlo Whitmore allowed herself for a single small second to believe that the worst was behind her. Then a voice spoke from the doorway of the vault. "That is impressive, kid. I have to admit it." The voice was lazy. The voice was lit from inside with a dirty kind of joy. The voice was the voice she had heard last night through the floorboards of her parlor, cursing her grandfather and cursing his own father. And now it was 8 feet behind her, on the wrong side of the only way out of a 6-foot concrete box. Marlo Whitmore turned around very slowly. He was leaning in the doorway of the vault. He had not come down the stairs. She would have heard the stairs. He had been hiding somewhere in the basement clutter behind the stacks of newspaper or the row of paint cans waiting. He had probably been there for hours. He had probably been there since before she had even come down the steps. He had watched her find the door. He had watched her press the bricks. He had let her open the vault for him. He was leaning on a wooden cane in his left hand. His right pant leg was rolled up to mid-thigh, and beneath it, his calf was wrapped in a thick pad of white gauze taped over what was clearly a deep gash from her broken floorboards. His face was paler than it had been the night before. His eyes were brighter. He was running on pain pills and adrenaline and pure greed, and Marlo could see in his face that none of it had made him cautious. It had made him reckless. In his right hand, he was holding a small black handgun. He was holding it the way a man holds a thing he has owned a long time. It was pointed at the center of her chest. "My name is Derek Bishop," he said. "I think you have already figured out that my father is your lawyer, the kindly old man, the pro bono saint. He worked your file from his pretty office on 6th Avenue, and he never once thought to lock his briefcase when he came home at night." He smiled. It was a thin, bright smile. There was a dot of dried blood at the corner of his mouth, from where he had bitten his lip on the way out of her parlor. "I read the file 2 weeks ago. I knew what the old man hid. I just didn't know where. I have to thank you, actually. I would have spent another month tearing apart the walls. You found the floor for me." Marlo did not speak. She watched him. She watched his right hand. The gun was steady. He was not nervous. He was not scared. He had done this before in his head 100 times. "Step out of the vault," he said. His voice had dropped a register. It had stopped being lazy. "Slowly. Hands where I can see them. Walk past me. I want you in the middle of the basement floor." She had nowhere to go. He stood between her and the only way out. The vault was concrete on 5 sides. The only door was the door he was filling with his body and his cane and his gun. "Your father," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "Your father is trying to help me." "My father is a sentimental fool who works for street trash for free." Derek's voice tightened, the first crack in the lazy smile. "Do you know how much my father has cost our family over the years with his free work, and his bleeding heart, and his charity files? Do you know how it feels to be a man's son and watch him give away your inheritance to homeless girls?" "Mr. Bishop." Marlowe took a single half step forward. She made the step look frightened. It was not entirely an act. "I don't want this. I don't want any of this. Just take it. I just want to leave." "Smart girl." Derek laughed short and ugly. "Smart girl. Step out." Slowly, Marlowe took another half step. Her boot scraped on the concrete floor of the vault. She kept her right hand visible. Her left hand, the one closer to the doorway, the one closer to him, hung loose at her side. Her fingers brushed her thigh. Her fingers brushed something else too. The handle of the iron crowbar she had set down on the floor of the vault when she had reached out to touch the gold. She had forgotten about the crowbar. He had not seen it. The shadow of the bottom shelf had hidden it from where he stood in the doorway. She had been in this house for 3 days. She had read the journal. She had read it twice. There had been a passage in the very last pages in the part where her grandfather's hand had been steadiest, the part he had written when he was almost done. The passage had not made sense to her on the first reading. It made sense now. The vault protects itself. The door answers only to the master's weight. Step out before you set the weight inside. The vault had a counterweight system. Marlowe had not understood what that meant when she read it. She understood now. She had stepped into the vault and her weight on the concrete floor had armed something. There was a mechanism. The bricks had opened the door. The weight inside the vault, when removed in the wrong way, would close it. She had read the diagram on the very last page of the journal. The diagram she had glanced at and not yet studied. There had been a small lever drawn on the outside of the vault wall, hidden in the brick of the coal chute. The lever was the kill switch. It was, she realized, in a kind of cold, clean burst. Less than 3 feet from where Derek Bishop was leaning his hip against the doorway, completely unaware, talking about his father. "Move, kid," he said. His patience was running out. The gun lifted slightly. "Now." Marlowe took one more half step. She swayed. She let her shoulders hunch. She let her face do everything she had been told her face had done on the streets of Portland when men had tried to size her up. Frightened, beaten, compliant. She made herself small. Derek Bishop's eyes flicked just for 1 second past her shoulder to the gold on the shelves behind her. It was a 1-second mistake. It was the only mistake he was going to make. Marlowe dropped. She did not lunge for him. She did not reach for the gun. Anyone who had ever seen a movie would have lunged for the gun, and anyone who had ever lunged for a gun in real life had usually died doing it. She dropped straight down on her knees on the concrete floor of the vault. Her left hand swept under the bottom shelf and closed around the handle of the iron crowbar. Her right hand braced against the floor. She came up hard in a single motion, her whole body uncoiling, and she swung the crowbar not at Derek Bishop, but past him, above his shoulder, into the brick of the coal chute wall behind him, into the small, hidden machined steel lever that her grandfather had built into the masonry 40 years ago and had drawn very carefully on the last page of his journal. The crowbar struck the lever with a heavy, ringing crash. Something inside the wall released. The whole vault door, The half-ton slab of brick-faced concrete that Marlowe had watched swing open 10 minutes earlier screamed on its steel hinges and began to swing the other way. Closed. Fast. Fast as a guillotine. There was a counterweight system buried in the wall, and Marlowe had just dropped its restraint, and now half a ton of stone was moving on its own physics back to where Harold Whitmore had set it long before she was born. Derek Bishop's brain caught up half a second late. His head whipped around. His mouth opened. The lazy, bright smile was gone, replaced by something almost childlike, the face of a man who has just understood in one perfect, terrible second what is about to happen to him. The cane in his left hand wobbled. The gun in his right hand came up reflexively, but there was nothing to shoot at. Marlowe had already rolled past him on the concrete under the swinging mass of the door out of the vault and into the basement. "Wait," he said the single word. Then the door slammed. The sound was not a crash. It was deeper than a crash. It was the deep, final, settling thud of half a ton of stone, meeting half a ton of stone, and somewhere inside the wall, a heavy steel locking bolt engaged with a low thunk that Marlowe felt in her sternum. Dust came down from the basement ceiling in a thin, pale rain. The lantern, which had fallen on its side when she rolled, threw a long, flat beam of white light across the concrete floor. It lit the bottom of the closed vault door and nothing else. Silence. Marlowe lay on the cold concrete on her back. She was breathing in short, hard pulls. Her right shoulder was bleeding where she had scraped it on the brick of the chute. The crowbar was still in her left hand. She had not let go of it. Her fingers were cramped around it. For maybe 10 seconds there was no sound at all. Then it began, muffled, nearly inaudible. The ghost of a voice from inside concrete 6 inches thick. A man's voice, yelling something. A man's fists pounding on something that did not give. Marlowe Whitmore lay on the floor of her grandfather's basement and listened to Derek Bishop scream. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel rage. She did not feel anything she had a name for. She felt very tired and very cold, and very far away from her own body, the way a person feels in the first minutes after a car accident. She has somehow walked away from. She sat up slowly. She let the crowbar lie. She reached into the inside pocket of her denim jacket past the wad of older $100 bills and pulled out the prepaid cell phone she had bought at the hardware store in town. She turned it on. The little screen lit up green. She dialed 3 numbers. She put the phone to her ear. Her hand was steady. She did not know when her hand had become steady. It had simply become steady. A woman's voice answered calm and professional on the second ring. 911. What is the address of your emergency? Marlowe. Whitmore looked up at the dark beams of her grandfather's house above her head. She thought about a girl under a piece of cardboard in a Portland alley 23 days ago. She thought about a click of a deadbolt closing behind her on her 18th birthday. She thought about her father William, whom she had never met. "My name is Marlowe Whitmore," she said into the phone. "I am at 442 Briarwood Lane in Astoria. There has been a break-in at my house. I have the intruder contained. He is armed. Please send the police." She paused. "Please tell them it is going to take some time to get him out." 6 months later, the late spring sun came up over the Columbia and lit the rooftops of Astoria one at a time like candles on a long, careful birthday cake. The light reached the top of Briarwood Lane. The light fell on a Victorian house 3 stories tall with a turret on the right side rising into a peaked roof. The roof was new. The shingles were dark gray. The clapboard had been stripped down to bare wood and repainted a deep, warm Victorian blue, the color of a calm ocean at dusk. The trim was crisp white. The wraparound porch had been rebuilt from the joists up by a local crew, and a row of wooden rocking chairs sat on it, now painted the same crisp white as the trim. The windows were new. Some of them had been done in stained glass. The largest one above the front door showed a tree with deep roots and a wide canopy. A small brass plaque polished had been mounted to the right of the front door, where a porch light used to be. It read in neat raised letters, "The Briarwood Foundation, a home for young people with nowhere left to go. Established in memory of Harold and Ellen Whitmore." Inside the house smelled of fresh pine, baking bread and coffee. The peeling wallpaper was gone. The mold was gone. The smell of mildew was gone, and in its place there were warm wood floors, soft cream walls, and the steady low sound of voices from a kitchen that ran like a kitchen should run. Marlo Whitmore walked into the foyer. She wore a pristine white sweater and a clipboard against her hip. Her hair, longer now, was pulled back. She had filled out a little. She had stopped looking around the eyes like a girl who had slept under cardboard for 22 days, although she would always look around the eyes like a young woman who knew exactly what cardboard felt like. And that was a good thing. That was a thing she had no intention of forgetting. The library at the back of the house had been rebuilt. The hidden wall cavity behind the bookshelves had been permanently sealed up by the contractors the zinc lining donated to a local museum. New bookshelves climbed the walls, now floor to ceiling packed with new books. There was a deep blue rug. There were 2 reading chairs by the window. 2 teenage girls were sitting in them, one with a paperback in her lap, the other with a notebook and a pen, and the second girl had her head tilted in concentration. And Marlo stopped at the doorway of the library for a moment and watched them and did not interrupt. The basement had been emptied. The newspapers, the broken clocks, the leather atlases, the folded American flag in its triangular case had all been cataloged and stored properly. The vault had been opened that first long afternoon by a county sheriff and 2 of his deputies and a locksmith and Walter Bishop himself. And the gold inside had been documented bar by bar over 3 days. 3 of the bars had been sold immediately to clear the back taxes and to set up a proper legal trust for Marlo. The remaining bullion had been moved in a slow, careful, heavily insured procession to a vault in a real bank in Portland. After taxes, after the lawyers, after the careful work of turning a paranoid old man's hidden fortune into a real and traceable inheritance, Marlo Whitmore had been left with a little over $4.2 million. It was more money than she could spend in her lifetime if she tried. She had not tried. She had not bought a sports car. She had not bought a beach house in Malibu. She had not gone on a single vacation. She had bought one thing and one thing only. She had bought back the house. She had bought back the roof her grandfather had wanted her to have. She had hired the contractors. She had hired the architects. She had paid the bills. And once the house was real again, she had done the only thing that had made any sense to her. The only thing that made sense to a girl who remembered the cardboard and the rain and the click of a deadbolt closing behind her. She had opened the door. The Briarwood Foundation took in young people between 16 and 21, kids who had aged out of foster care, kids who had been thrown out by parents like Roy Crane, kids who had been sleeping under the back porches of churches and the loading docks of grocery stores. They had real beds upstairs in the Whitmore house. They had hot food. They had a counselor on staff. They had a roof. They had a door that locked from the inside and stayed locked because they were the ones who locked it. Derek Bishop had been pulled out of the vault alive, but no longer arrogant 11 hours after Marlo had called 911. He had stood trial 3 months later for breaking and entering, attempted armed robbery, and attempted murder. He had been sentenced to 15 years in state prison. His father, Walter Bishop, had not spoken in his defense. Walter had aged 10 years in 3 months. He had handled Marlowe's estate work without taking a single dollar in fees. On the day Derek had been sentenced, Walter had walked out of the Multnomah County Courthouse into a cold January rain, and Marlowe had been waiting for him on the sidewalk. And she had not said anything, and Walter had not said anything. And they had stood for a long time under her umbrella. And then she had taken him to a diner for a sandwich. Walter sat on the board of the Briarwood Foundation now. So did the woman from the Astoria grocery store, Marge, who had once slid a free apple across her counter to a frightened girl. So did the man with the gray mustache from the hardware store, who had recognized a Whitmore around the eyes. Renata Crane had called once 2 months in after she had read about the foundation in a Portland newspaper. Marlowe had not picked up. The voicemail had been long. The voicemail had been full of words like, "I miss you, and I'm proud of you, and I always loved you." And Marlowe had listened to all of it sitting on the front steps of the Briarwood house with a cup of coffee. And when it was over, she had deleted it. She had not blocked the number. She had not yelled. She had just deleted the message and finished her coffee and gone back inside. She thought often about her grandfather. She thought about a man who had spent the last decade of his life converting his fortune into bars of yellow metal because he believed the world was about to end, and who had hidden those bars in the foundation of his house because he believed the only safe place was a place he could touch with his own 2 hands. She thought about how lonely that must have been. She thought about how much he must have loved her father. She thought about how much, in his strange, fortified, paranoid way, he must have loved her, a granddaughter he had never met, to leave it all to her with the door of the vault answering only to the weight of someone willing to step inside. The morning sun reached the front foyer. Marlowe stood at the window beside the heavy front door and watched the light move across the porch boards. In the kitchen, 2 of the older girls were laughing about something. In the library, the girl with the notebook had started to write. Outside, a cargo vessel was moving slow down the Columbia toward the open sea, the way her grandfather had spent his working life designing them to move. The foghorn called once far away. In her right hand, almost without thinking about it, Marlowe held the heavy brass key her grandfather had left her. The original one. The first thing she had ever owned. She turned it slowly in her fingers, feeling the weight of it, feeling the scratches on its old surface. She thought about a girl under a piece of cardboard in a Portland alley. She thought about a frightened 18-year-old kneeling on a dusty floor and being told she had inherited a ruined house and $12,000 in unpaid taxes and 60 days to figure it out. She thought about an old man in a paranoid basement building, a vault that would only open for someone willing to come down and find him. Her grandfather had built a fortress she thought to keep the world out. She had torn down the walls. She had used what he had buried, and finally, after 18 years of looking, she had found the one thing she had been searching for the whole time. She had found home.